Miss Marple and the Case of the Disappearing Diary. Chapter 1. A Birthday, a Bouquet, and a Blank Page. The morning of Mrs. Hortense Blackwell's 73rd birthday began, as most mornings in the village of Little Witchford did, with a delivery of flowers and a flurry of speculation. At precisely 10 minutes past 8, young Lily Drew, the postmistress's daughter, arrived at Rosebriar Cottage carrying a neat bundle of post and a vase of golden chrysanthemums. The card tucked among the blooms read simply, "To H.B. with fondest memories, L.C." "Who's L.C.?" Lily had asked boldly, for she was at the age where the thrill of mild impudence outweighed good manners. But Mrs. Blackwell, still in her housecoat and slippers, had only smiled faintly, her pale blue eyes narrowing with the ghost of an old story. "A foolish boy who once thought himself very clever," she said. By 8:30, the flowers had been moved to the sideboard in the sitting-room. The post had been sorted into keep and burn, and Mrs. Blackwell had retired to her study to write her customary morning pages in her diary. She always wrote before breakfast, 5 lines a day, rain or shine, as ritualized as a priest's prayers. Except that morning, the diary was gone. Not misplaced. Gone. The top drawer, where it had lived for over 3 decades, was open and empty. The velvet pouch it rested in had been carefully folded and replaced. But the book, bound in faded navy leather, with the initials H.E.G. etched in gold, was missing. Mrs. Blackwell, whose composure was as much a part of village identity as the war memorial or the vestry bake sale, felt something she had not felt in years. A tremor of panic, not the kind brought by misplacing a spectacles case or overcooking a roast, but the deeper, stomach-knotting kind, the kind that suggested one's past had suddenly become dangerously relevant. By noon, the matter had not been reported, but everyone knew something was afoot. She looked quite drawn at the greengrocer's, whispered Mavis Crouch to her sister Eileen. And not a word about the fate. That woman hasn't missed a fundraising raffle in 20 years. At the vicarage, Reverend Giles was told by his wife that he was not to bring up Mrs. Blackwell's birthday sermon unless he wished to eat supper alone. And at the corner table of the tea-room, Miss Jane Marple stirred her cup of Assam tea and listened to it all without comment, nodding pleasantly as stories made their rounds. It wasn't until the next morning that she was invited to Rosebriar. The note was short and oddly formal. "Dear Miss Marple, if you can spare an hour this afternoon, I would very much value your sense of calm. Please come alone. Discretion is everything. Yours, H. Blackwell. Miss Marple, intrigued but unsurprised, put aside her knitting and made her way through the garden paths, arriving at Rosebriar at precisely 2 o'clock. She was shown into the sitting-room, where Mrs. Blackwell stood by the window, back straight, a cup of untouched tea in her hand. "You've heard the whispers, I assume," the older woman said without turning. "I've heard several," Miss Marple replied gently, "though none loud enough to call a fact." Mrs. Blackwell turned then, her gaze sharp. "My diary is missing, Miss Marple. Stolen? I can think of no other explanation. May I ask when you last saw it?" "Yesterday morning, before the flowers arrived." Miss Marple nodded. "May I also ask what the diary contained?" Mrs. Blackwell hesitated. "It contains memories, names, some truths that might be better off forgotten, and one or two that, if revealed, could cause real damage, such as the woman sat, placing her teacup down with a delicate rattle. During the war, there were things I witnessed, things I chose not to report. One man in particular, long presumed dead, but I later learned he survived under an assumed name. He lives in this village now. That much I am certain of. Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly. A serious accusation. Indeed, said Mrs. Blackwell, which is why I never spoke of it. I wrote it down instead, along with a great many other details. A diary is meant to be private, Miss Marple, until someone decides it shouldn't be. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. And you believe someone knew the contents of the diary? I do, and I believe that person came into my home yesterday and took it. No sign of forced entry? None, which makes it worse. It means the thief was someone I know. Miss Marple was silent for a long moment. Might I ask to see the room where you kept it? Mrs. Blackwell led her to the study. It was a narrow, orderly room filled with aged books, dried roses, and the scent of beeswax and old paper. The desk was immaculate. The drawer opened smoothly. Empty. Nothing disturbed except a single faint smudge on the inside lip of the drawer. Miss Marple leaned in, inspecting it. Left thumbprint, she said quietly. Someone in a hurry, or perhaps nervous. Mrs. Blackwell stood in the doorway. Can you help me? Miss Marple looked up. I believe so, but I shall need to attend the garden club meeting tomorrow. Mrs. Blackwell blinked. The garden club? Miss Marple gave a faint smile. Yes, that's where I expect the real story will begin. And outside, as the wind rustled the hedge maze and the roses began to unfurl their first blush of spring, little Witchford waited, unknowing that its secrets had just begun to bloom. Chapter 2. The village starts talking the morning after. Miss Marple's visit to Rosebriar Cottage, little Witchford, began to stir with the peculiar electricity that only a fresh scandal could spark. The incident itself had not yet reached the public ear in its true form. No one knew about the diary. But the ripples of something just out of sight had begun to spread, like the first tremors before a landslide. At the village green, where Tuesday always brought the flower stall and a modest selection of local vegetables, the talk began in earnest. She cancelled her seat at the garden club, muttered Mrs. Braithwaite to her friend Judith Sharp, as she paid for a punnet of gooseberries. Said she wasn't feeling sociable. Hortense Blackwell, not sociable. The woman's hosted every committee meeting since '47. And did you see her with Reverend Moffat on Sunday? Judith added in a stage whisper. Cornered him by the vestry like a barrister about to draw blood. Said something about what's left unspoken can be just as dangerous as what's said. That curious statement made its way by lunchtime to the tea shop, where Miss Hartnell was holding court over her usual pot of Ceylon. Unspoken, she said. Miss Hartnell repeated, holding her spoon aloft for effect. Now what could that mean? Surely not a scandal from the war? I always said she kept herself just a bit too quiet about those years. And that bouquet on her birthday, added Mrs. Crouch, nibbling her Victoria sponge with intent. Chrysanthemums. Everyone knows they're for funerals, not celebrations. Across the village, while these theories bloomed like wild weeds, Miss Marple sat with her knitting at the periphery of the weekly garden club meeting, held that day in the sunny back room of the old schoolhouse. There were 20 members in attendance, each with strong opinions about soil pH and slug deterrents, and more importantly, each one a careful observer of their neighbours, even if they claimed otherwise. "I always say," began Mrs. Lillian Sproat, president of the club and self-appointed guardian of geraniums, "that honesty in compost is honesty in character. You can't hide decay, not really. It always finds its way to the surface." Miss Marple, winding her yarn, offered a warm smile. "Very true. And speaking of surface things, has anyone noticed how very little we see of dear Mr. Aldrich these days?" A pause. Several heads turned. "Basil Aldrich?" asked young Veronica Gillett, who kept bees and spoke rarely unless discussing hive. "Maintenance. He's been quiet," Mrs. Sproat admitted, "though his tulips were fine this year. A little heavy on the nitrogen, but that's men for you. He used to walk his dog at the green every morning," Miss Marple continued mildly, "but I've not seen him since Sunday. Curious when one considers how fond he was of speaking with Mrs. Blackwell." Veronica bit her lip. Didn't she once give him a scarf for Christmas? "Hand-knitted," added Miss Sproat. "Must have taken weeks." The topic drifted, but not far. Soon it was Basil Aldrich's odd reclusiveness that occupied the discussion. How he had stopped attending the chess group, how he'd left the vicar's luncheon early 2 weeks ago, and how, according to Mrs. Crouch's window cleaner's nephew, he had received a letter marked "Foreign Post" just last week. Meanwhile, Miss Marple listened, hands still, one stitch paused in mid-loop. After the meeting, she made her way to the chemist's, where Mr. Pelham, a soft-spoken widower with an excellent memory, managed the prescriptions and village gossip in equal measure. "Miss Marple," he said brightly as she entered, "you're looking spry. Spring agrees with you." "Thank you, Mr. Pelham," she replied. "I'm actually hoping to find something for a mild headache. I've had rather a lot of information to sort lately." He chuckled. "You and everyone else. Word is, something odd's happened at Rosebriar. Is that so?" "Oh, yes, and you know what I always say. When someone disappears from a rota, someone else notices. Basil Aldrich, for example. Skipped his quinine pickup for 3 days now. That man never forgets his dosage. I have half a mind to send young Peter over with a note." "Perhaps do," Miss Marple said kindly. "Some things, I think, are best not left to worsen." She made her next call at Rosebriar once dusk had begun to fall. Mrs. Blackwell greeted her in a housecoat and pearls, a fine contradiction that suited her perfectly. "Well?" she asked without preamble. "Any whispers worth worrying about?" "More than whispers," Miss Marple replied, handing her. Chapter 3. An Afternoon at Aldrich House. The following afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Aldrich House, a modest but well-kept Georgian cottage nestled at the edge of Little Witchford's eastern lane, shaded by hawthorns and framed with ivy that had grown just a touch too wild. Basil Aldrich, when he was visible, could usually be seen trimming that very ivy with clinical precision. But now the leaves curled freely along the window frames, unkempt and neglected. Miss Marple had not made an appointment. She rarely did when the truth required subtle introduction. She rapped smartly on the door. The sound echoed, No answer. She knocked again, longer this time, before stepping back and looking discreetly to either side. The cottage was quiet, not abandoned, no signs of hasty flight, no shuttered windows, but still too quiet for the middle of the afternoon. Just as she turned to leave, the door creaked open a mere inch. A single pale eye peered through. Miss Marple. The voice was cracked, weary. "Mr. Aldrich," she said, smiling kindly. "How very good to see you. I hope I'm not intruding." He hesitated, then opened the door further. Basil Aldrich looked older than usual, his greying hair rumpled, his collar slightly undone, and a faint tremor in his hands that hadn't been there the last time she saw him lead the prayers at the Thursday book club. "You are always welcome," he said softly. "Please come in." The interior of Aldrich House was, as always, spotless. But this time something had changed. The surfaces were overly bare. A few framed photos were missing from the mantelpiece, and the heavy oak writing desk was locked. What a rare sign of caution from a man who prided himself on transparency. "Would you like tea?" he asked, already walking toward the kitchen. "No, thank you," Miss Marple replied. "Just a moment of your time. I've come not as a neighbour, but as a friend, one who finds herself increasingly concerned about the welfare of others." Looked over his shoulder, the corners of his mouth twitching faintly. "You mean Hortense?" "I do," Miss Marple said gently. "She's quite distressed, and I believe you know why." A silence stretched between them. He returned and sat opposite her, lowering himself slowly into the armchair, as if it had grown unfamiliar. His eyes were dark with something far heavier than guilt. Grief, perhaps, or dread. "She knows," he murmured. "She always did, she suspects," Miss Marple corrected. "But it is not knowledge that frightens her. It is what someone might do with knowledge." He stared into the hearth, though there was no fire. "I thought I had buried it all," he said. "Changed my name, built a life. Good works, clean habits. What else is a man to do when he's haunted?" Miss Marple said nothing. Her eyes remained soft but steady. "It was 1944, he went on. Paris. I was young, frightened, angry. I had lost my brother the year before, and I wanted revenge. Yes, even as I worked with the resistance. But I also wanted survival. There was a man, officer named Lucier. He offered information, and I accepted it. In return, I passed along what little I knew about movements in our cell. I didn't know they would use it to raid the schoolhouse." He swallowed. "There were children there, Miss Marple. I told myself it was a mistake, a miscommunication. But I knew." Miss Marple sat very still. "And Hortense? She saw me leaving the meeting place, said nothing for years. Then one day she sent a note, a kind note, no accusation, just a line. 'I remember what you wore that day. That was all.'" Miss Marple took a breath. "And when the diary disappeared, she feared its contents might expose you. She's trying to protect me even now." He laughed bitterly. "She who should hate me most." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Then why are you hiding?" His gaze flicked toward the locked desk. "Because someone else found out. Someone who wanted to use it, or destroy it." "You believe someone else took the diary?" He nodded slowly. "And if they did, I think they might try again. Or worse." Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. Then it would help us both to know who was seen near Rosebriar that morning." Basil looked up. "You have someone in mind?" She didn't answer directly. "Tell me, Mr. Aldrich, who else knew you had been in Paris during the war? Not just vaguely, but knew of your exact whereabouts?" "No one," he said, then paused, "except perhaps Felix Barnum." Miss Marple tilted her head. "The solicitor?" "We served in the same division. After the war, he handled my documents, my change of identity. He understood. He never judged." "He's a discreet man," Miss Marple said, "but also a practical one." Basil leaned forward. "You think he—" "I think," she said, gently, "someone knew where to look. The diary was not hidden. It was kept in a predictable place. Someone who knew how secrets were stored." At that moment, a knock echoed from the front door. Basil stiffened. Miss Marple stood calmly and walked to open it. Felix Barnum stood there, umbrella in hand, his hat wet with drizzle. His eyes flicked over Miss Marple, then beyond to the man, seated by the hearth. "I came to speak with Mr. Aldrich," he said, measured and polite. "I think," Miss Marple replied, "you'd best come in, but do sit carefully. The truth, I've found, tends to settle quickly once all the players are seated." Barnum stepped inside, and Miss Marple closed the door behind him with a soft click. The secrets of the war were no longer just in memory. They had found their way into the present. And in Little Witchford, no truth stayed buried for long. Chapter 4. The solicitor's silence. Felix Barnum entered the drawing-room with the composure of a man used to dark rooms and darker confidences. He removed his hat, set his damp umbrella in the stand with an economical flick of the wrist, and took the armchair furthest from Basil Aldrich, as if physical distance could also shield him from moral association. Miss Marple watched with quiet interest. "Tea," she offered. "No, thank you," Barnum said crisply, brushing a fleck of lint from his sleeve. "I prefer we come straight to it." Basil shifted in his chair, eyes lowered. He looked as though he'd aged 5 years in the last 24 hours. "You know why I've come," Barnum began, turning to him. "There's a letter. Or rather, there was." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to him. "A letter?" Barnum exhaled. "Mrs. Blackwell's diary contains mention of it. An old private letter from Basil to a man named Lucier. A letter which she apparently found tucked between pages of an old ledger, years after the war." Basil looked up sharply. "She never told me that, nor should she have," Barnum replied too quickly. "But it made its way into the diary, along with details, names, implications." Miss Marple nodded slightly, her needles idle in her lap. "And you, Mr. Barnum, did you see this diary?" Barnum met her gaze. "No, but I had cause to believe it existed. Hortense once hinted years ago that she had compiled certain recollections. After her brother died, she began writing them down." "Her brother?" Miss Marple asked mildly. Barnum's jaw tensed. "Henry Elgood. He was among those taken during the schoolhouse raid in Paris. A child, 12 years old. He was never seen again." A silence settled. Basil's face turned ashen. "I never knew," he whispered. "No," Barnum said coldly. "You didn't ask." Miss Marple cleared her throat gently. "But the diary, Mr. Barnum, you knew it existed. Yet you said nothing until now. Why? The solicitor hesitated. Because I thought it might never surface. I thought Hortense would die before anything came to light. I didn't wish to cause more pain. Miss Marple shook her head with a soft cluck of disapproval. Or perhaps you didn't want the matter traced to you. Barnum stiffened. What are you suggesting? That someone entered Rosebriar, she replied, and took that diary from her drawer, and the only people who knew what the diary might contain were Mrs. Blackwell and you. Barnum scoffed. You're speculating wildly, Miss Marple. No, she said, I'm observing carefully. Mrs. Blackwell was not careless. She kept the diary in the same place for decades. That drawer had no marks of tampering, no sign of violence. The thief knew where to look, and more importantly, what to look for. Barnum's lips pressed into a tight line. Even if I did take it, he said finally, I would not have done so to protect myself. Oh, I'm quite sure you wouldn't, Miss Marple agreed. But you would do it to protect her. Basil's head jerked up. Her? Miss Marple turned slightly. Judith Sharp. The name dropped like a stone in the room. Barnum paled. That's absurd. No, it's logical, Miss Marple replied. Judith's name appears in more whispered conversations than most. She arrived here shortly after the war. Alone, respectable, and curiously reticent about her family. She also happened to lodge briefly with Hortense before purchasing her own cottage. A fact few remember, as it was barely for 6 weeks. What has that to do with this? Barnum asked, more defensive now. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. Because Judith is not who she claims to be. Her real name, I believe, is Judith Lucier, the niece of the man Basil wrote to, a man later executed for treason, her father's brother. Basil sat bolt upright. That can't be. I'm afraid it is, said Miss Marple gently. And I believe Felix Barnum knew it. I believe you helped her adopt a new name and history, as you once did for Basil. Not out of profit, but guilt. You knew what her uncle had done. You felt responsible. Barnum's hands were clenched. She was only 19. Her name was poison. She'd done nothing wrong. And yet, Miss Marple said softly, her name in that diary would have drawn suspicion all over again. Hortense may never have accused her outright, but even the mention would be enough to unravel everything Judith rebuilt. Basil sat silently, hands trembling in his lap. Chapter 5. Truth. Written in ink. The following morning broke warm and damp, a soft drizzle lingering over Little Witchford like a veil not quite ready to lift. Birds chirped hesitantly from hedgerows, and the cobblestones of the main road gleamed with yesterday's memory of rain. At Rosebriar Cottage, the curtains remained drawn until nearly 10, a rare deviation from Mrs. Blackwell's meticulous routine. But by mid-morning, the windows were open, a fire was lit, and a familiar silver tea service stood polished on the parlour table. Miss Marple arrived with a basket of scones and her customary gentle smile. Hortense Blackwell greeted her at the door herself. I've had visitors, she said without preamble. Miss Marple nodded. I rather thought you might. They moved into the parlour, where the diary sat on the table, its navy leather cover restored, its gilt initials catching the firelight. It looked almost regal, as though the ordeal had only enhanced its importance. He brought it back, Hortense said softly, Felix, he didn't lie. He returned it just as he'd found it. No pages torn, no ink smudged. And did he tell you why he took it? Yes. He said it was to protect someone. Not himself, though I dare say he knew his fingerprints were all over it. He mentioned a name, Judith Lucier. Miss Marple stirred her tea. And you knew who she was? I suspected. I never confirmed it, of course, but I recalled the eyes. She has her uncle's eyes, cold, narrow, and uncertain of where to look when cornered. She has made a life here, Miss Marple said. A careful one. Careful is not the same as honest, Mrs. Blackwell replied, though without venom. Still, I shall not expose her. It would serve no purpose now. There was a pause, as if both women needed a moment to breathe through everything that had been unearthed. I read the diary again last night, Mrs. Blackwell said at last. From the beginning. 38 years of entries. Some as trivial as a jam recipe, others heavier. Miss Marple looked at her kindly. And did it change how you see it all now? No, she said, but it clarified things, especially the letter. Basil's letter to Lucier? Hortense nodded. It wasn't a betrayal, not in the way I thought. It was a plea for asylum. He was trying to save someone from within the resistance, I think. But it was intercepted. The letter became evidence. And that, I suspect, is what doomed the children in the schoolhouse. Not treason, misfortune. Did you tell Basil that? He came this morning. He looked as if he'd not slept in days. And I told him what I knew, what I believed. I told him I could forgive him. And can you? Hortense hesitated, her eyes fixed on the hearth. I don't know. But I've said the words. And sometimes that's the start. The fire crackled softly between them. Outside, footsteps approached along the path, slow and hesitant. A moment later, the doorbell rang. Hortense rose and moved to the window. It's Judith. Miss Marple stood. I think it might be best if you speak with her alone. Do you think she knows? That the diary is back? Yes. That you know who she truly is? No, but she may suspect, and that may be enough. Hortense nodded. You've been terribly helpful, Miss Marple. Miss Marple smiled gently. Only observant, which, in a village like ours, is rather dangerous. She departed quietly, her footsteps vanishing into the damp path. Inside, Hortense opened the door. Judith Sharp stood beneath a plain umbrella, her face composed, but her shoulders stiff with something not unlike dread. Hortense, she said, softly. I'm sorry to intrude. You're not intruding, Hortense replied. Judith hesitated. I came to ask about the diary. I've heard whispers. It has been returned, Hortense said simply. Untouched. I see. There was a long pause. I know who you are, Hortense said, her voice low but firm. Who you were. Judith flinched but did not speak. I knew the name, your uncle's name. I remembered it from the papers. And when you came to me all those years ago, I recognized the echo of it. I never meant harm, Judith whispered. I know. I only wanted peace, to live somewhere small, unimportant. And I thought if I helped others enough, joined the book group, made myself useful, no one would care who I once was. Hortense studied her. And did anyone ever? No, not until now. Then perhaps, Hortense said. "You've done your penance, even if it was never your crime." Judith blinked quickly, as if blinking away something unspoken. "I'm sorry," she said again. "Go home, Judith," Hortense replied. "Plant your tulips. Bake something dreadful for the fate. We've all lived with secrets." Judith left, quiet as smoke. Across the village, Miss Marple paused at the edge of the green, where children now played in boots and muddied coats. A spaniel barked at the ducks near the pond. The church bell tolled noon. She knew the village would move on. It always did. The surface would be raked smooth again. The gossip would fade, and new dramas would emerge. Perhaps over who had trimmed the roses too aggressively, or who had failed to return the Women's Guild teacups. But beneath it, something had shifted. Chituchu, past had spoken, not with shouting, but with ink. Old fading ink that still had the power to sting. And she, as always, had listened. Chapter 6. The Man with the Envelope. The rain returned the following afternoon, soft and persistent, painting the village rooftops in long grey strokes and turning the garden paths to shallow streams. The drizzle brought with it a hush. Children stayed indoors, and even the dogs barked more softly, as if unwilling to pierce the quiet. Miss Marple, content to remain indoors, sat by her parlour window with a patchwork shawl around her shoulders, and her latest knitting, a moss-green jumper for her great-niece, in progress. She was not expecting visitors, which made the knock on her door all the more curious. She opened it to find a man in a damp wool coat, not young, not old, with a face that seemed too mild to remember and too plain to describe. His umbrella dripped steadily onto the stone step, and in his gloved hands he held a long brown envelope. "Miss Marple?" he asked politely. "Yes. I've been instructed to deliver this to you in person. No signature required, just confirmation that you are who I believe you to be." "Indeed I am," she said, eyeing the envelope. "And you are?" "A clerk, legal affairs, Felix Barnum's office." She nodded, unsurprised. The man handed her the envelope, tipped his hat with a kind of mechanical grace, and disappeared down the garden path before she could offer tea. Miss Marple closed the door and examined the envelope. It bore no markings, beyond her name, written in Felix Barnum's neat, careful script. She carried it to the writing desk and opened it with the small silver paper knife she kept tucked beside her stamp box. Inside were 2 sheets of notepaper and a single photograph. I read first, Miss Marple. As promised, I returned the diary, but I found in my own archive something I had forgotten I kept. I am entrusting it to you now, in the hope that your wisdom will weigh it better than mine ever could. It is a letter, written not by Basil Aldrich, nor by Hortense, but by a third party, someone not yet named in our discussions. The man who delivered it to my office years ago was French, frail, and deeply afraid. He did not stay in England, but he left this behind, and I never had the courage to destroy it. Use it as you see fit. Yours, Felix Barnum. Miss Marple unfolded the second sheet slowly. The paper was thinner, older, the ink faded but legible. It had clearly been written in haste, words tight and lines cramped. To whomever finds this, Basil Aldrich is not guilty. He sent a warning. It arrived too late, but he risked himself to send it. I intercepted it on the 19th, having already passed false intelligence to Lucier under orders. Basil believed he was writing to a friend. I was the traitor. The raid on the schoolhouse was planned before Basil ever put pen to paper. His letter changed nothing. But he tried. I have told no one. I cannot carry this into death. Jean des Hôtels below. The signature was a date, November 1944. Miss Marple sat back in her chair. The photograph, folded and creased, was of 3 young men. Basil Aldrich was unmistakable, his jaw sharper, his eyes brighter. Beside him stood a man in a military coat, arms crossed, expression wary. On the far right, a third man with sloping shoulders and a pinched expression, Jean des Hôtels. No doubt, on the back of the photograph, someone had scrawled, Brussels, early 1944. She stared at the page in her hand for a long while, letting the full weight of its contents settle. Basil had tried to save lives, not doomed them. He had lived for years believing the opposite, and Hortense had suffered in silence with her suspicions, never knowing that the man she resented most had in fact done the bravest thing of all. And Felix Barnum, conscious of both past sins and present loyalties, had chosen to pass the burden. To her, Miss Marple rose and crossed to the mantel, where her small clock ticked softly. There were now several possibilities ahead of her, all branching like fine cracks in porcelain. She could take the letter to Hortense and free her of her bitterness. She could show it to Basil to restore his belief in himself, or she could destroy it entirely, letting the truth die quietly, as so many wartime truths had. But she was not one for destruction. Instead, she placed the letter and photograph into a fresh envelope, sealed it, and carefully wrote for Mrs. Hortense, Blackwell, across the front. She would deliver it herself in the morning. Let the truth find its own voice. That evening, at supper with Miss Hartnell, the topic of conversation drifted, inevitably, back to Judith Sharp, and the quiet stir she had caused by changing the flower order for the harvest luncheon. She switched the chrysanthemums to lilies, Miss Hartnell said, scandalized, as if. Chapter 7. Pages that turned themselves the next morning was unusually still. A low fog lay over Little Witchford, softening the edges of the hedgerows and church spire, muting the village colours into shades of pearl and pewter. It was the sort of morning that made time feel suspended, when news lingered in the air like dew, and the birds, sensing something unspoken, waited before singing. Miss Marple dressed early and left her cottage by 8:30, envelope in hand. She wore a sensible coat and her rain hat, though the sky promised no storm. There was a certain formality to her movements, a quiet ceremony in what she carried. Rosebriar's gate creaked ever so slightly as she passed through. Mrs. Blackwell was already in the sitting-room, her tea untouched, her posture unusually still. She turned when Miss Marple entered, as if she had been waiting exactly for that sound. "You've brought something," she said softly. "I have." Miss Marple handed her the envelope without embellishment, and Mrs. Blackwell took it with both hands. For a moment she simply held it, then slit the top neatly with the edge of a letter-opener shaped like a feather. She read silently. First the letter, then the photograph. Her hands trembled just once as she lowered the pages to her lap. Never knew another man was involved, she said at last, her voice rasping as if from disuse. Agent des hôtels. His name was never spoken at the tribunal. Not in the documents I saw. He carried the guilt, Miss Marple said, and it seems Basil carried the blame. Mrs. Blackwell gave a small, sharp breath. And I carried the wrong burden. She turned her gaze to the fire. I spent years convinced Basil's cowardice had led to Henry's death. I didn't hate him. I never could. But I couldn't bring myself to forgive what I believed he had done. And yet, all this time, it was a stranger. She shook her head once, as though trying to shake off the enormity of it. Miss Marple said gently, "There is no ceremony for unburdening the dead, but there are small acts that honour them." Mrs. Blackwell looked up. "What would you have me do? Let Basil know, in your own time, and perhaps let yourself heal a little, too." Mrs. Blackwell was quiet for a long moment, her thumb tracing the edge of the photo. "He looked so young," she whispered. "They all did. I suppose we were children playing spies, and the world didn't wait for us to grow up before asking us to decide who we were." Miss Marple, who had seen too many lives shaped by that very truth, said nothing. Later that day, Mrs. Blackwell wrote a letter. It was short and written on her personal stationery, in the firm, elegant hand she had used for invitations and committee minutes for decades. She sealed it with her family crest and handed it to her housekeeper, Mrs. Fallon. "Please take this to Mr. Aldrich," she said. "Deliver it by hand." No questions were asked. The letter arrived at Aldrich House just after noon. Basil read it alone, seated at the same desk where he had once drafted weekly chess announcements for the village newsletter. The words were, "Simple. I know now what you did, what you tried to do. I am sorry for my silence. You are not the man I thought you were. You are something braver. H.H." He folded it carefully, set it in the drawer, and sat quietly for nearly an hour before rising and walking out into his garden. The ivy had grown thick again. This time he did not trim it. Meanwhile, back in the village, another story had begun to stir. At the tea shop, young Lily Drew burst in around 3 o'clock with the wide-eyed urgency only a child could produce. "Mrs. Sharps locked herself out," she announced breathlessly, "and Constable Phelps had to come and get in through the pantry window. She dropped a tray of seed packets and stepped right on the daffodil bulbs." "Disaster," muttered Mrs. Crouch, biting into her eclair. "Those bulbs cost her nearly 6 shillings. "Quite suspicious," added Mrs. Hartnell. "Never known Judith to misplace a key. I told you all, it's the strain of the luncheon planning." Miss Marple, who had been quietly stirring her tea, smiled faintly. It had not escaped her notice that Judith Sharp's forgetfulness had begun precisely after Hortense's visit. Nor had it escaped her that Judith had removed herself from several social committees over the past week, claiming exhaustion and poor eyesight. She was withdrawing, but not hiding. A subtle retreat, not a disappearance. As Miss Marple walked home that evening, she passed Judith's cottage. The curtains were drawn, but a light flickered behind them, steady, warm. Not all absolution required public penance. The next morning, the church bells rang early for a wedding rehearsal, and the village returned to its normal rhythm. The diary remained locked away, its secrets mostly known, its power now spent. But for Miss Marple, there was one detail still unsettled. That evening, she penned a letter of her own. Dear Mr. Barnum, you acted with misguided care, but you acted nonetheless. I trust your office will do no further archiving of items that belong elsewhere. And if you ever feel the weight of too many secrets again, I recommend rosemary oil, a firm walk, and speaking them aloud before they settle too deeply. Sincerely, Jane Marple. She posted it the next day. Some truths, she believed, turned sour if kept too long. But others, those that were finally spoken, finally heard, had a way of turning their own pages. Chapter 8. The Last Entry. The following week brought with it a welcome shift in the air. Spring at last arriving in earnest. Daffodils unfurled along the lanes like yellow punctuation. Marks and the first bees of the season buzzed with single-minded cheer through the hedgerows of Little Witchford. It was the sort of week when most things were forgiven, or at least forgotten. And yet a quiet tension still lingered, faint like the scent of hyacinths that clung after sundown. Though the diary had been returned, and confessions made in cautious doses, Miss Marple could not shake the sense that one piece of the puzzle remained, unspoken. It wasn't until Thursday morning, as she sat replanting her lavender bed, that the final fragment arrived. It came not by post, but by hand. Mrs. Fallon, the discreet and ever-watchful housekeeper of Rosebriar, appeared at Miss Marple's gate holding a small bundle wrapped in patterned cloth. "From Mrs. Blackwell," she said. "She said you'd know when to open it." Miss Marple rose from her stool, brushed soil from her skirt, and accepted the bundle with a nod. "Thank you, Mrs. Fallon." Once back inside, she unwrapped the cloth slowly. Inside was the diary, not the entire collection, just one volume, dated 1944-1946. The gold-embossed initials HGG were faded but intact, and the scent of pressed lavender rose faintly from the pages. A small slip of notepaper lay folded atop it. "Dear Miss Marple, there are entries in here I have not read since the day I wrote them. I believe it is time someone else did. Not for judgment, for understanding. Only one name appears on the final page. I don't know why I wrote it down. Perhaps I wanted it known some day. Perhaps I simply wanted it seen. Whatever it means, if anything, you will make more sense of it than I can." Hortense Miss Marple sat down in her armchair and opened the diary with reverent care. The handwriting was precise, upright, and unmistakably Hortense, controlled even in moments of emotional turmoil. The entries began routinely: weather notes, committee decisions, snippets of village scandal. But then came the early summer of 1944. The tone changed. The script grew sharper. June 4th. Letter from the front via Margaret's brother. Henry's school in Paris remains under occupation. Rumours of movement nearby. Uneasy. June 18th. A man passed information to the wrong hands. I heard the name whispered in a corridor. Basil, June 20th. I saw him today. His eyes wouldn't meet mine. He knows what I know, or what I think I know. July 5. News has reached us. The school was raided. The children were gone before dawn. No survivors. My brother is gone. Miss Marple paused. She could feel the grief inside those tight loops of ink. Not dramatic, but devastating. Hortense had bled through the nib of her fountain pen, not in tears, but in restraint. Then came an entry dated August 3rd, 1945. Basil wrote me today. A general letter, nothing personal. And yet I sense in the careful way he refers to those years that he is watching me, waiting to see if I will answer. I won't. He deserves to wonder. Then, 2 pages later, something curious. December 29th, 1945. A woman called Judith came to Rosebriar. Young. London accent faded beneath careful enunciation. Claims to be a teacher between posts. Something about her feels watched. I offered the spare room. For now. Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly. Then the final entry. Dated March 2nd, 1946. Judith is leaving tomorrow. Says she's found work near Oxford. She thanked me, but never once asked a personal question, as though fearful of the answers she might receive. I don't know her real name. But last night as I passed her door, I saw the edge of a letter poking from her bag. The name on it was Lucier. There it is then. Truth drawn out by silence. I have said nothing and will continue to say nothing. But I am writing it here, because the moment I forget, the war wins. HHEG. There was no further entry. Miss Marple closed the diary slowly, as if not to wake something sleeping within it. Judith had left a long time ago, yet the ghost of her arrival had stayed in those pages inked in secrecy and understood only by one person, and now by 2. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made one last visit. Judith Sharp answered the door with her hair pinned back and gardening gloves tucked in her apron. "Miss Marple," she said cautiously. "I wasn't expecting—" "No, I expect not," Miss Marple said. "May I come in?" Judith hesitated, then nodded. Inside, the cottage was neat but lived in. A vase of Frisia's saint. Chapter 9. Of seeds and silences, spring had truly taken hold of little Witchford by the time April turned its second corner. The morning frost had vanished from the grass, replaced by the slow, deliberate growth of tulips and crocuses, each unfolding as if summoned by unseen instructions. The cemetery wisteria began its pale descent, draping the stone wall like a silk shawl, and the scent of fresh soil followed every gardener like a quiet signature. Miss Marple had always believed the earth told stories, not just through bones and buried objects, but through the things that took root despite them. And as she dug her trowel gently into the raised bed behind her cottage that morning, she thought of all that had been sown in silence, hidden beneath layers of grief, fear, and forgotten names. She had not heard from Judith Sharp since their conversation, nor had she expected to. Some truths require solitude to settle, like seeds that germinate in darkness before they ever seek the sun. But she had heard from Basil Aldrich. A letter, posted discreetly and marked only with the initials B.A., had arrived 3 days prior. Miss Marple, I will not say thank you, for gratitude feels too thin a word to place atop the burden you've lifted. Instead, I offer a promise. I shall no longer hide, not from others, and not from myself. Hortense and I shared tea yesterday. No forgiveness was asked, but something gentler passed between us. Something unfinished that no longer needs finishing. If you ever wish to play a match of chess again, I promise I will not let you win as easily. Yours sincerely. Basil Miss Marple had smiled at that. Now, as she sprinkled marigold seeds in neat little rows, she felt the season turning not only in nature, but in the people around her. Even Felix Barnum had reappeared, walking the lanes with his customary umbrella and stiff gait, though now with a new softness to his nods. He had resigned his partnership at the law office in Much Davington, to make room for younger minds, he claimed. But Miss Marple suspected it was more than that. There are certain tasks one cannot complete when weighed down by too much memory, and then, of course, there was Hortense. The diary had not been returned to its locked drawer. Instead, it now rested on a small shelf in the sitting room at Rosebriar Cottage, unhidden, unspoken of, but clearly visible. The space around it had been cleared of clutter, as though Hortense meant it to be seen, if not read. When Miss Marple called on her that week, she was greeted not with the usual careful poise, but with a kind of quiet readiness. They sat in the drawing-room with blackcurrant cordial and a plate of butter biscuits. "It feels strange," Hortense said after a while, "to walk through the village and not feel like I'm carrying something no one else can see." Miss Marple nodded. "Burdens rarely make noise, but they do weigh. I'm not sure I'll ever stop grieving Henry," she said, "but I think I can finally stop using him as the measure for my silences." Miss Marple's fingers paused over her knitting. "You gave him a voice, Hortense, even if only in ink." Hortense looked toward the shelf. "I still don't know if I should have written that last name, Judith's. I think you wrote it because you knew someone would need to see it, not to punish her, but to understand her." A silence passed between them, broken only by the soft ticking of the mantel clock. Outside, the church bell rang the half-hour, and with it came the sound of approaching footsteps on gravel. Moments later, the bell at the garden gate chimed. Mrs. Fallon poked her head into the room. "A visitor, madam, Miss Sharp." Hortense blinked. "Now?" She asked for only a moment, but she has something in her hands. Hortense stood slowly. "Show her into the garden." Miss Marple placed her knitting on the armrest. "Shall I—" "No," Hortense said, her voice firm but calm. "Stay." The two women stepped out into the garden, where Judith waited near the rose beds, holding a small wooden box in both hands. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Oh," she said, her voice unusually small. "Not at all," said Hortense. Judith looked at Miss Marple, then back at Hortense. "I've been thinking," she said, "and I've realized I don't want my history to only live in the spaces people are too polite to ask about. So I've brought something." She opened the lid of the box. Inside was a single bundle of letters, tied with a red ribbon. The top one was addressed in French script. "Judith Lucier, laundress." "They're mine," Judith said. "All of them. From before. I kept them too long. I thought they anchored me, but they've only kept me from growing." Hortense said nothing. She looked at the box, then up at the woman before her. "I won't ask what they say," she said. Gently, Judith smiled faintly. "You don't have to." She extended the box. "Burn them, if you'd like. Or read them, or keep them. I just don't want them any more." Hortense took them in both hands. "Thank you," she said. "That's more than I expected." Miss Marple remained quiet throughout, the same way she might have watched a rare rose unfold, patiently, without interruption. And when Judith turned to leave, she paused beside Miss Marple. "You were right," she said softly. "Some pages don't need to be turned. They just need to be placed in the right hands." As she disappeared down the path, the garden felt larger. Miss Marple turned to Hortense. "Will you read them?" "I don't know yet," she said, "but I think I'll keep them near the diary. The past and the almost past, side by side." Miss Marple smiled. "It's where they belong." They returned inside as the clouds broke and sunlight touched the window pane. And in that warmth, Miss Marple thought, not of secrets buried, but of seeds finally taking root. Chapter 10. The Final Bloom. The second Sunday in April dawned bright and windless, as though the whole of Little Witchford had exhaled after holding its breath too long. The sky stretched in a flawless blue, and the churchyard bees returned early, bumbling lazily between tufts of narcissus and clover. Miss Marple, seated at her pew near the back of St. Mildred's, observed the village in all its orchestrated ritual. Hortense Blackwell arrived punctually, as she always had, though now she smiled gently as she passed the choir stalls. Basil Aldrich followed some minutes later, placing himself not beside her, but 2 rows back, a quiet courtesy born of understanding, not distance. Judith Sharp was there too, standing stiffly during the hymn, and relaxing only once the organ fell silent. She wore a hat of pale grey, with a soft brim that cast a respectful shadow over her expression. No one stared at her, no one whispered, and that, Miss Marple knew, was its own kind of absolution. After the service, the vicar invited the congregation to linger for a light garden luncheon. Tables had been set in the churchyard, laid with treacle tarts, scones, and plates of sliced cucumber sandwiches. It was a gentle affair, full of laughter that did not pierce, and silences that no longer pressed uncomfortably against the ribs. Miss Marple found herself seated between Mr. Denholm, who complained that his daffodils had bloomed obscenely early, and Miss Hartnell, who was busy critiquing the quality of the lemonade. Too tart, like Edith Pritchard's poetry. She listened politely and smiled at the appropriate moments, her gaze flickering now and then to the shifting patterns of interaction around her. Basil and Hortense shared a few quiet words over the strawberry jam. Judith fetched tea and offered it with unspoken thanks. Even Felix Barnum had come, though he lingered at the periphery, offering his presence as quietly as a closing parenthesis. It had taken weeks, but peace, once elusive, now bloomed in unexpected corners. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple returned to her cottage and sat down to write a letter. This time, not to a solicitor or a suspect, but to her niece in Devon. "My dear Raymond, you asked me not long ago whether I ever missed London, its bustle, its dramas, its noise. I told you then that I preferred the quiet, but I realize now what I truly meant was, I prefer the meaning beneath the quiet. We had a rather strange series of events here, nothing so dramatic as a murder, though the ghost of one did linger in the margins. It involved a diary, a war, and more than a few things people wished they could forget. But of course, forgetting is rarely honest, and I find that the most dangerous lies are often the ones we tell ourselves. Still, in the end, it all resolved. Not neatly, perhaps, but truthfully. And that, I think, is all one can ask. The garden is beginning to bloom again. The lilacs are putting on a rather bold display, and the sparrows have returned to the eaves with a vengeance. I believe even the scarecrow in Mrs. Crouch's field looks pleased. Do visit when you can. I've discovered an excellent new recipe for rhubarb tart. With affection, your ever-loving Aunt Jane. She sealed the letter and placed it on the hall table for the afternoon post. Then she returned to the garden, where the tulips nodded and the cat from the next cottage had already claimed the sunniest patch of flagstone. There, under the gentle shade of her climbing roses, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment to breathe. Not as a detective, not as a keeper of secrets, but simply as a woman watching the world settle. The mystery had not required handcuffs or courtrooms. There had been no dramatic arrests, no last-minute confessions in locked rooms. What it required was patience, observation, and the understanding that guilt is not always about law-breaking, but about the burden of memory, the ache of not being believed, the weight of never being heard. Basil had written, tried, failed, and then silenced himself. Hortense had grieved with anger, lived with half-truths, and finally faced the full one. Judith had hidden behind a name, behind control, behind purpose, until silence became its own prison. And yet none of them were villain.